A millionaire gave $375 to a humble woman to take a taxi during a storm. The next morning, he saw her at the grave of his loved one who died 25 years ago. The rain hit the windows like an unrelenting drumbeat as Garrett Thompson sat behind his desk, staring blankly at the piles of papers and reports in front of him. The city outside was blurred by the downpour, making the already gray day seem even more dismal. It was just another night for Garrett, another evening spent alone in his towering office, where wealth and power meant little against the hollowness he felt inside. He sighed deeply, running a hand through his graying hair. It had been 25 years since Evelyn, his fiancée, had passed. 25 long years of burying himself in business deals and contracts to avoid confronting the grief that never quite left him. Despite his success, his life felt empty, a void that no amount of money could fill. As he gathered his things to leave, the storm intensified, lightning flashing across the dark sky. Garrett could hear the wind howling as he stepped into the lobby of his office building. It was late, and the usually bustling building was now deserted, save for the cleaning staff. He noticed a young woman, drenched from head to toe, standing near the entrance, her hair matted down by the rain. She seemed frustrated, her eyes scanning the street, presumably looking for a way home. Garrett paused. It wasn't his habit to get involved in anyone's affairs, especially not someone he didn't know, but something about the way she looked, so small and vulnerable against the harsh storm, struck a chord in him. He hesitated for a moment, then walked toward her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying a calm authority despite the chaos outside. The woman turned, surprised, clutching her bag tightly against her soaked body. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. Her clothes were drenched, and she shivered from the cold. "Are you all right?" Garrett asked, noting the way she glanced anxiously at the street. "Do you need help?" She shook her head quickly. "I'll be fine. I just can't find a cab. That's all." She looked down at her wet shoes, clearly embarrassed by the situation. Garrett glanced out at the empty street. There wasn't a single car in sight. "It's pretty bad out there," he said, his voice softer now. Without giving it much thought, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills. "Here, take this. It should be enough to get you a ride when one comes by." The woman's eyes widened in surprise. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly. Please," Garrett interrupted, pressing the money into her hand. "Consider it a favor. No one should be stuck out in a storm like this." She stared at the money in her hand, stunned for a moment. Then, her face softened, and she looked up at him with a grateful smile. "Thank you. I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Garrett replied. "Just get home safe." The woman nodded, her smile faltering as she glanced once more at the raging storm outside. "I'll try." As she stepped toward the door, she paused. "What's your name?" "I'd like to repay you somehow." Garrett gave her a small smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's not necessary, really." She nodded again, but before stepping out into the rain, she turned back once more. "I'm June, by the way. Thank you, Mr. Thompson," he said after a brief pause. "Garrett Thompson." June smiled softly, then disappeared into the storm, her figure quickly swallowed by the sheets of rain. Garrett stood by the door for a moment, watching her go, a strange sense of melancholy washing over him. There was something about her, something that tugged at him in a way he hadn't felt in years. But as quickly as the feeling came, he pushed it aside. Stepping out into the rain himself, Garrett made his way to his car, the cold droplets soaking through his jacket as he drove off into the night. Little did he know, that brief encounter with June would set into motion a series of events that would forever alter the course of his life. As he drove home, the rain continued to pound the streets, but Garrett's mind was elsewhere. Tomorrow was a day he had marked on his calendar for the past 25 years. The anniversary of Evelyn's death. Every year, without fail, he visited her grave, leaving flowers and lingering in the silence, trying to feel some connection to the woman he had lost too soon. And as the storm raged on outside, Garrett couldn't help but feel that this year, something was different. The following morning, the storm had passed, leaving the city blanketed in a fog that clung to the streets. Garrett awoke early, his routine unchanged for the past quarter of a century. On this day, the anniversary of Evelyn's death, nothing else mattered. It was a day reserved for grief and remembrance, a time to reconnect with the woman he had lost so long ago. He dressed slowly, choosing the same black suit he always wore on this day, a solemn uniform for a solemn ritual. As he tied his tie, his reflection in the mirror caught his attention. The lines on his face seemed deeper, the gray in his hair more prominent than the year before. Time had taken its toll, but the memory of Evelyn remained as vivid as ever. Driving to the cemetery, Garrett couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled over him since the previous night. His encounter with June, though brief, had stirred something in him. It was as though her presence, her vulnerability in the storm, had reopened a wound he thought he had learned to live with. But today, he couldn't let himself dwell on it. Today was for Evelyn. The cemetery was quiet as he arrived, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath his shoes as he walked the familiar path to her grave. The air was cool, the remnants of the storm lingering in the dampness that hung in the air. He carried a bouquet of white lilies, Evelyn's favorite, just as he did every year. But as he approached her resting place, Garrett stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. Someone was already there. Kneeling by Evelyn's grave was a woman, her head bowed, hands delicately placing a bouquet of flowers on the headstone. For a moment, Garrett thought he was imagining things. Who could possibly be here, paying their respects to the woman he loved? His heart pounded in his chest as he took a few steps closer, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Then, the woman looked up, and Garrett's confusion turned to shock. It was her, June. The woman from last night, the young woman he had given money to in the storm, was now kneeling at Evelyn's grave, tears streaming down her face. For a moment, Garrett was frozen. A million questions flooded his mind, but none made any sense. Why was June here? How did she know Evelyn? His heart raced as he struggled to find his voice. June? Garrett's voice broke the silence, rough and confused. She turned slowly, her face pale, eyes red from crying. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them seemed thick with an unspoken understanding, but Garrett couldn't grasp what was happening. Mr. Thompson? June's voice was soft, barely a whisper. She wiped her eyes hastily, as if embarrassed to be caught in such a vulnerable moment. What are you doing here? Garrett asked, his words coming out harsher than he intended. He wasn't angry, just confused, and perhaps a little scared. He had spent years coming to this place alone, and now it felt like his private sanctuary had been invaded. June stood slowly, brushing the dirt from her knees. She looked down at the grave, then back at Garrett, her face a mixture of sadness and something deeper. I didn't expect to see you here, she said softly. Garrett shook his head, still trying to make sense of it. You knew Evelyn. June nodded, her eyes welling up with fresh tears. She was my mother. Garrett felt the ground shift beneath him. He blinked, staring at June as if seeing her for the first time. Your mother? June took a deep breath, as if summoning the strength to explain. I didn't know her well. She died when I was young, and I was raised in an orphanage after that. But I always knew about her. I've spent years trying to find out more, trying to trace her past. I only recently discovered where she was buried. Garrett felt like the wind had been knocked out of him. Evelyn had a daughter. How was that possible? His mind raced back to their time together, to all the moments they shared before her tragic death. She had never mentioned having a child. But then again, their time had been cut short before they could truly build a life together. Could Evelyn have kept such a secret from him? The silence stretched between them as Garrett tried to process what he was hearing. His gaze fell to the flowers June had placed on the grave, white lilies, just like the ones he carried. The coincidence was unsettling, as if fate had somehow woven their paths together. "I didn't know," Garrett whispered, more to himself than to her. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the grave, from the name etched into the stone. Evelyn Roberts, beloved fiancée, gone too soon. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, grief, shock, and a strange sense of connection that he couldn't quite explain. June watched him silently, her face etched with pain. "I didn't know about you either," she admitted after a moment. "Not until last night. I had no idea who you were." Garrett's chest tightened at her words. It was all too much to take in at once. He had come here, as he did every year, expecting to be alone with his memories. Now, standing beside Evelyn's daughter, her flesh and blood, he felt as if the world had shifted beneath his feet. The questions piled up in his mind, but he couldn't bring himself to ask them, not yet. June's voice was soft when she spoke again, hesitant. "I know this must be a shock. It is for me too. But I've spent my whole life wondering about her, wondering what she was like, who she loved. And now I find you, standing here, at her grave." Garrett finally tore his eyes away from the headstone and looked at June. The pain in her eyes mirrored his own, and in that moment, he felt a strange kinship with her, both of them bound by their love for a woman neither could truly have. "I'm sorry," June said softly. "I didn't mean to intrude." Garrett shook his head, his voice hoarse. "No, you're not intruding." As the fog slowly began to lift around them, Garrett realized that this meeting, this strange, unexpected connection, might be the closest he'd ever get to Evelyn again. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely alone. Garrett stood silently, his mind spinning as he tried to process the revelation that June had just laid before him. Evelyn had a daughter, the woman he had loved more than anyone, the woman whose death had shattered him, had left behind a child. And somehow, he had never known. His throat tightened, and his eyes fell once again to the grave, the memories of his time with Evelyn rushing back all at once. "You're Evelyn's daughter," Garrett murmured, almost as if saying it out loud would make it feel real. He looked up at June, still struggling to make sense of the situation. But how? When? June nodded, tears still brimming in her eyes, and took a deep breath before answering. "She had me before she met you. My father, I never knew him. From what I've been able to piece together, they weren't together long, and she never told him about me." She paused, as if the weight of the words was hard to carry. "After she died, I ended up in an orphanage. I've spent most of my life trying to find out more about her, about where I came from. It's taken me years just to find this place." Garrett felt a pang of guilt settle in his chest. How could he not have known? He and Evelyn had been so close, or at least he thought they had been. But the time they had shared was brief, too brief for him to have known everything about her life before they met. Still, the idea that she had kept something so monumental from him gnawed at him. "I had no idea," Garrett whispered, the words feeling hollow as they left his lips. He looked at June, seeing in her the same sadness that had lingered in his own heart for years. "She never told me." June nodded, understanding. "I don't think she wanted anyone to know. Maybe she was trying to protect me, or maybe it was just too painful for her to talk about. I'll never really know." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken questions that neither of them seemed ready to ask. Garrett stared at the ground, his mind clouded with memories of Evelyn, her laughter, the way she had made him feel alive in a way no one else ever had. He had spent so long mourning her loss, and now, standing here with her daughter, it felt as if the pieces of his life had been rearranged in a way he couldn't quite comprehend. I came here today, like I do every year, to bring her flowers," Garrett said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's been 25 years, and yet, it still feels like yesterday." June watched him, her expression softening. "I know the feeling," she said quietly. "I never really got to know her, but I've always felt like something was missing, like a part of me was lost with her." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared grief hanging in the air between them. Garrett wasn't sure what to say. How could he possibly explain the connection he had with Evelyn, the way she had been his entire world? And how could June, who had never truly known her mother, feel that same sense of loss? After a few moments, June spoke again. "I didn't know who you were last night. I had no idea you were the man my mother was with when she died. I'm sorry if this is all overwhelming." Garrett shook his head, a sad smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You don't have to apologize. I'm the one who should be sorry." He looked down at the flowers still in his hand, the same lilies he had brought every year. "I didn't know she had a child. If I had, things might have been different." June frowned slightly, her eyes searching his face. "Different how?" Garrett sighed deeply, the weight of the years pressing down on him. "I don't know. I would have done something. Maybe I could have helped. Maybe you wouldn't have had to grow up without knowing her." He paused, the ache in his chest growing stronger with each word. "I loved her more than anything, and yet there was so much I didn't know about her." June nodded, her expression softening. "She must have loved you too, to keep you in her life, even with everything she had been through." "That says something." Garrett blinked, surprised by the sincerity in her words. He had spent so many years wondering if Evelyn had truly felt the same way he had. They had been torn apart so suddenly, and he had never gotten the closure he needed. But now, hearing those words from June, he felt a small sense of comfort. "I hope so," Garrett murmured, his gaze drifting back to the headstone. He crouched down beside the grave, gently placing the lilies on top of the stone. "I hope she knew how much she meant to me." June stood beside him, her eyes soft as she watched him. "I think she did," she said quietly. "And now, maybe I can learn more about her. From you." Garrett looked up at her, surprised by the vulnerability in her voice. He realized, in that moment, that June was searching for the same thing he had been all these years. Closure. A connection to the woman who had shaped both of their lives, even in her absence. "I'd like that," Garrett said after a moment. "I can tell you everything I remember about her. It might not be much, but it's something." June smiled, a small but genuine smile that seemed to lift the heaviness between them. "I'd like that too." As they stood together by the grave, Garrett couldn't help but feel that fate had brought them together for a reason. There was still so much he didn't understand, so many unanswered questions about Evelyn and her past. But in June, he saw a chance to reconnect with the woman he had lost, and perhaps to find a new beginning in the process. For the first time in a long while, Garrett felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps this meeting, this strange and unexpected connection, was exactly what he needed to heal the wounds he had carried for so long. And perhaps, through June, he could finally begin to make peace with the past. Garrett couldn't shake the feeling that his life had taken an unexpected turn. As he drove back home from the cemetery, the weight of the day's revelations pressed on his chest like a heavy stone. Evelyn had a daughter, June, and he had only just met her by sheer chance. The thought seemed surreal, almost impossible. But the look in June's eyes, the pain she carried, confirmed everything. Pulling into his long driveway, Garrett let out a deep sigh as he turned off the car. His mansion loomed in front of him, grand and imposing, yet it felt emptier than ever before. For years, he had poured himself into his work, using the luxury and success to fill the void left by Evelyn's death. But no amount of wealth or power had been able to replace the simple joy of being with her, Now, with June entering his life, that void felt different. Not quite filled, but changed. Garrett wasn't sure if he was ready to confront what that meant, but he knew he couldn't ignore it either. As he walked inside, the echo of his footsteps through the grand hall only heightened his sense of isolation. He poured himself a drink and sat down by the large window that overlooked his estate, the light fading as dusk settled over the city. His thoughts wandered back to June and the unexpected connection they now shared. She was Evelyn's daughter. Her daughter. And for a brief moment, Garrett had felt something familiar in June's presence, something that reminded him of Evelyn. The same quiet strength, the same gentle sadness. He had to admit, part of him was drawn to her not just because of the past, but because she seemed like a living link to Evelyn, a piece of her that was still here in the world. But that also made everything more complicated. How could he offer June any kind of support when he was still struggling to make sense of his own emotions? She had grown up without a mother, without anyone to tell her about the woman who had been the center of Garrett's world. And in all these years, he had never once considered that Evelyn might have left behind more than memories. He took a long sip of his drink, his mind swirling with questions. How had Evelyn kept this from him? Had she intended to tell him about June? Or was it a secret she planned to carry to the grave? Garrett felt a mix of emotions: sadness, frustration, confusion, but most of all, regret. Regret that he hadn't known sooner, that he hadn't been there for June when she was growing up. As the hours passed and the night grew darker, Garrett found himself staring out into the empty horizon, lost in thought. He hadn't been there for Evelyn in her final moments, and now it felt like he had a second chance to be there for someone connected to her. The next morning, Garrett made a decision. He couldn't sit idly by while June wandered through life without answers. If Evelyn had been important to her, if June was looking for the same kind of closure he had spent years searching for, then perhaps they could help each other. Perhaps, together, they could piece together the parts of Evelyn's life that had remained hidden for so long. He picked up the phone and dialed the number June had given him when they parted ways at the cemetery. The phone rang twice before she picked up, her voice soft and cautious on the other end. "Hello?" June's voice came through the line, and Garrett felt a strange sense of relief hearing it. "June, it's Garrett," he said, trying to keep his tone steady. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I wanted to see if we could meet again." There was a pause on the other end, and Garrett could almost hear June's mind racing. I wasn't expecting you to call so soon," she admitted quietly. "I know," Garrett replied. "I wasn't planning on calling either, but I think we both have a lot of questions, and I don't want to leave things unfinished. If you're willing, I'd like to talk more about Evelyn, about everything." June was silent for a moment before she responded. "Yeah, I think that would be good. I've been thinking about it too. There's a lot I don't know, and maybe you can help me understand more about her." Garrett nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Let's meet somewhere quiet. I know a cafe near the park where we can talk." June agreed, and they set a time to meet later that day. As Garrett hung up the phone, he felt a knot of tension in his chest loosen slightly. He wasn't sure what would come of this meeting, but at least it was a step toward understanding, a step toward making peace with the past. Later that afternoon, Garrett arrived at the cafe, a small, cozy place tucked away from the bustle of the city. He found a table near the window and waited, watching the world go by as people hurried along the street. His thoughts drifted to Evelyn once again, as they often did. What would she think of this? Of him meeting her daughter after all these years? Would she have wanted this? His thoughts were interrupted when he saw June walk in, looking slightly unsure of herself as she scanned the room. Garrett waved her over, and she gave him a tentative smile as she approached. "Hi," June said as she sat down across from him. "Thanks for meeting with me." "Of course," Garrett replied, his voice calm but sincere. "I think we both have a lot to talk about." June nodded, folding her hands in her lap. I've been thinking a lot since yesterday. It's strange. I've spent my whole life searching for answers about my mom, and now, here you are. I didn't even know you existed until 2 days ago." Garrett gave a small, sad smile. "I didn't know about you either. But now that we've found each other, maybe we can help each other understand more about her." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared connection settling between them. Garrett could see the uncertainty in June's eyes, but there was also a quiet determination there. She wanted answers, and so did he. "Tell me more about her," June said finally, her voice soft but steady. "What was she like? What was she like when you knew her?" Garrett took a deep breath, the memories of Evelyn flooding back. "She was everything to me," he began. "Smart, kind, strong-willed. We didn't have a lot of time together, but in the time we did have, she made me feel more alive than I had in years. She had a way of making you feel like the most important person in the room, even when everything else around you was falling apart." June listened intently, her eyes never leaving Garrett's face. "I wish I could remember her," she said quietly. "I was too young when she died. All I have are the stories I've heard and the little bits and pieces I've managed to find." Garrett nodded, understanding the pain of longing for someone who was gone. "We'll figure this out together," he said softly. "We'll piece together the parts of her life that we both missed." As the afternoon turned into evening, Garrett and June continued talking, sharing memories, hopes, and the weight of their mutual grief. Slowly, a fragile bond began to form between them, one built on loss, but also on the hope that through each other, they could keep Evelyn's memory alive. Garrett found himself thinking about June more often than he expected. Their conversation at the cafe lingered in his mind, like the faintest echo of something unresolved. The more they talked about Evelyn, the more he felt a connection to her daughter, a connection that felt fragile, yet undeniable. Still, it was difficult to know how much he should offer. He wanted to help June, but a part of him also feared getting too close. After all, it had been 25 years since he had let anyone into his life. Sitting in his office, surrounded by stacks of contracts and business reports, Garrett tried to focus on the day ahead. But his thoughts kept drifting back to June. There was something about her that stirred memories of Evelyn, and it wasn't just the fact that they shared blood. June had a quiet strength, much like Evelyn had. It was that same strength that had drawn Garrett to her all those years ago. But it was also what made him cautious now. Getting too close to June would mean reopening wounds he had spent years trying to heal. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from June. "June, I was thinking, maybe we could visit her grave together sometime. It might help, talking about her while we're there. What do you think?" Garrett stared at the message for a moment, his heart tugging in two different directions. He knew this was important to her. It was important to him, too. But the thought of standing at Evelyn's grave, talking about her with her daughter, felt almost too raw, too real. Still, he couldn't deny that a part of him wanted to say yes. After a moment, he typed his response. "Garrett, I think that's a good idea. Let me know when you're ready, and we'll go together." He hit send before he could second-guess himself. Almost immediately, a wave of uncertainty washed over him. Was he making the right decision? Should he be allowing himself to get so involved with June when the wounds from the past were still so fresh? The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and phone calls, but no matter how hard Garrett tried to focus, his mind kept wandering back to the upcoming visit to the cemetery. It felt like the past was pulling him in, forcing him to confront things he had buried for so long. But this time, he wasn't doing it alone. Later that evening, Garrett sat in his study, a glass of whiskey in hand. The house was quiet, as it always was, the emptiness more pronounced now that June had re-entered his life. He stared out the window, watching the sun set over the horizon, his thoughts tangled in memories of Evelyn and the questions that still haunted him. What would Evelyn think of all this? of him meeting her daughter, sharing these moments with her. Would she have wanted this? Or would it have been too painful, too complicated? The next few days passed quickly, and before Garrett knew it, the day of their planned visit to the cemetery had arrived. June texted him early that morning, confirming the time they would meet. Garrett felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread. As much as he wanted to be there for June, a part of him wasn't sure he was ready to face Evelyn's grave again, this time with her daughter at his side. When Garrett arrived at the cemetery, he found June already waiting near the entrance, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked nervous, her gaze shifting to the ground as he approached. "Hi," she said softly, offering him a small smile. "Thanks for agreeing to come." "Of course," Garrett replied, his voice steady despite the nerves he felt gnawing at him. "I think it's important that we do this together." June nodded, but she still seemed hesitant, as if she wasn't sure how to proceed. They began walking toward Evelyn's grave in silence, the cool autumn air brushing against their faces. Garrett could feel the tension between them, the weight of what this visit meant. It wasn't just about paying respects to Evelyn. It was about coming to terms with the past, and perhaps even finding a way to move forward. When they reached the grave, June knelt down and placed a bouquet of fresh lilies on the headstone. The same flowers Garrett had brought the first time he had met her here. The sight of them brought a lump to his throat, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. "I brought these for her," June said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know what kind of flowers she liked, so I thought this would be appropriate." Garrett swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the headstone. "You chose well," he said softly. "Lilies were her favorite." June smiled faintly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I didn't know," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I wish I had known more about her. I wish I had more memories, more stories. But I don't." Garrett felt a pang of sympathy. He had spent so many years grieving for Evelyn, for the life they never got to share. But for June, the loss was even more profound. She had been robbed of the chance to know her mother, to build a relationship with the woman who had meant everything to Garrett. "You'll learn more," Garrett said, his voice steady. "I'll help you. Whatever I know, whatever I remember, it's yours." June looked up at him, her expression softening. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means a lot to me." They stood in silence for a while, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. Garrett's mind drifted back to his years with Evelyn, the memories bittersweet as they resurfaced. He had loved her with everything he had, but it had never felt like enough. Now, standing here with June, it felt like he was finally being given a chance to honor her memory in a way he hadn't before. "I think she'd be happy to know we found each other," June said softly, breaking the silence. Garrett glanced at her, surprised by the quiet certainty in her voice. "You think so?" June nodded. "Yeah, I do. I think she'd want us to be there for each other, to help each other through this. It's what she would have wanted." Garrett felt his throat tighten, the weight of June's words sinking in. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was what Evelyn would have wanted, for the two people she cared about most to find each other, to support each other through the pain of losing her. As they stood together by the grave, the past felt a little less heavy. And for the first time in a long time, Garrett allowed himself to feel something other than grief. It wasn't closure, not yet, but it was a start, a tentative step toward healing. And for now, that was enough. The days following their visit to the cemetery were marked by a sense of quiet contemplation. Garrett found himself reflecting not only on his memories of Evelyn, but on the fragments of her life that he had never known, pieces of her story that June was now uncovering. Their conversations became more frequent, and each time they spoke, it felt as if they were peeling back another layer of a past that had remained hidden for so long. June, in particular, seemed driven by an almost relentless need to understand more about her mother. The more Garrett shared with her, the more questions she had. And it wasn't just curiosity. It was as though she was trying to piece together the puzzle of her own identity, searching for answers that would help her make sense of the woman who had given her life, but whom she had never truly known. One afternoon, June called Garrett with a sense of urgency in her voice. "I found something," she said, her words quick and excited. "I was going through some old papers I found at the orphanage where I grew up. There are documents, letters even. Some of them mention a man, but the names are so faded, I can't read all of it." Garrett's heart skipped a beat. Could this be a lead, a connection to Evelyn's life before they met, and perhaps to the mysterious father that June had never known? His mind raced with possibilities, but he kept his voice steady. "Can you bring them over? I'd like to see them." Within an hour, June arrived at Garrett's home, a small stack of yellowed papers clutched in her hands. She seemed anxious, her eyes darting around the room as if unsure how to begin. "I didn't know where else to go," she admitted, setting the papers on the table in front of Garrett. "I've been staring at these for hours, trying to make sense of them, but it's hard to read some of the handwriting, and parts are just gone." Garrett picked up one of the papers, his brow furrowing as he examined it closely. The ink was faded, and time had not been kind to the brittle edges of the documents, but there were still fragments of sentences that stood out. Words like father and relationship caught his attention immediately. "These letters, do you think they're from your mother?" Garrett asked, glancing up at June. "I think so," she said softly. "At least, that's what I was told. They were kept in a file with my birth records, but they're so incomplete. I don't know who wrote them or who they were for. I was hoping you might recognize something." Garrett nodded, though he wasn't sure how much help he could be. He began reading through the letters carefully, piecing together what little he could. There were mentions of a difficult relationship, and something about a child, though the details were frustratingly vague. Garrett's heart sank as he realized that these letters might only deepen the mystery rather than solve it. "There's one more thing," June said, her voice quieter now. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small photograph, worn at the edges but still clear. It was a picture of a younger Evelyn, standing with a man Garrett didn't recognize. The man's arm was draped casually over her shoulder, and they both wore easy smiles, the kind that suggested familiarity, maybe even love. Garrett stared at the photo, his mind racing. He had never seen this picture before, and the man beside Evelyn was a complete stranger. He felt a pang of jealousy mixed with confusion. Who was this man? Was he June's father? And if so, why had Evelyn never told him about this part of her life? June must have sensed his discomfort because she spoke up, her tone apologetic. "I didn't mean to spring this on you, Garrett. I need to know who he is. If he was my father." Garrett swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling in. "I understand," he said softly. "You deserve to know, and I'll do whatever I can to help you find out." Together, they pored over the papers and the photograph, searching for any clue that might lead them to an answer. Garrett felt a strange mixture of emotions. Part of him was drawn to June's determination, her need to find closure. But another part of him felt a deep sadness, knowing that he hadn't been part of this chapter of Evelyn's life. The woman he had loved had a past he knew nothing about, and it made him feel like a stranger in his own memories. "I don't think we'll find everything here," Garrett said after a long silence. "These letters, they're too fragmented, but there might be other records, maybe from when you were born." June nodded, though the frustration was clear on her face. "I've tried looking into my birth records before, but they're incomplete too. It's like there are pieces missing from every part of my life." Garrett felt a deep sympathy for her. "You're not alone in this," he said gently. "We'll keep looking. If there's anything out there that can help you find out who your father was, we'll find it." June's eyes softened, and she gave him a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Garrett. I didn't expect you to be this involved. I thought I'd have to do this all on my own." "You don't have to do it alone," Garrett replied. "Not anymore." As the afternoon turned into evening, they continued working together, tracing the faint lines of Evelyn's past. With every letter they deciphered, every detail they uncovered, Garrett felt himself growing closer to June. It wasn't just about finding answers anymore. It was about building something new from the pieces of their shared history. By the time June left that evening, Garrett felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. He wasn't just helping June for her sake, he was doing it for himself too. There was something healing about the process, something that made him feel as if he was finally beginning to understand the parts of Evelyn's life that had always been just out of reach. But as he closed the door behind June and looked down at the photograph in his hand, Garrett couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than either of them had realized. The man in the photo was a mystery, and Garrett knew that until they uncovered his identity, the past would remain incomplete. For now, though, he was content to take things one step at a time. June had brought new life into his world, and for the first time in a long while, Garrett felt like he was moving forward, one careful step after another. As the weeks passed, Garrett and June found themselves spending more time together. What had started as a cautious relationship, born out of shared grief and curiosity, slowly began to evolve into something deeper. Their conversations grew more frequent, their meetings more relaxed. Each interaction brought them closer, and it became clear that their connection wasn't just about Evelyn anymore. It was about them, and the strange but undeniable bond they were forming. For Garrett, these moments with June felt like a second chance, an opportunity to not only reconnect with the memory of Evelyn, but also to build a relationship with someone who, in many ways, filled the void left by her absence. And for June, Garrett became a source of comfort and stability, someone who understood the pain of losing Evelyn and who could help her navigate the complexities of her past. One afternoon, they met at a park near Garrett's home, a quiet place where they could talk without distractions. The crisp autumn air filled their lungs as they walked along the tree-lined paths, the sound of leaves crunching beneath their feet. Garrett had always found this park calming, a place where he could think clearly. Today, it felt even more peaceful with June by his side. "It's strange, you know," June said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "I've spent so many years feeling like I didn't belong anywhere, like I was drifting through life without any real connections. And now, well, I guess I didn't expect to find someone who understood what that feels like." Garrett glanced at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "You're not drifting anymore," he said, his voice steady. "You have a place now, with me." June smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "I know, and I appreciate it more than you realize. It's just, I never imagined my life would turn out this way. Meeting you, learning all this about my mother, it's like everything I thought I knew is changing." Garrett nodded, understanding her struggle. He had felt the same way when June had entered his life, disrupting the carefully constructed walls he had built around himself. "Change isn't always easy," he said after a moment, "but sometimes it's necessary. It's how we move forward." June seemed to consider this for a moment before responding. "I guess I'm still figuring out what moving forward means for me." They walked in silence for a while, the wind gently tugging at their coats. Garrett could sense that June was wrestling with something, a question or a thought that she wasn't quite ready to voice. He waited, knowing that whatever it was, she would tell him when she was ready. Finally, she spoke again, her voice softer this time. Do you think my mother ever wanted to tell me about you? About her life before I was born?" Garrett's heart tightened at the question. He had wondered the same thing many times since meeting June. Why had Evelyn never mentioned her daughter? Why had she kept this part of her life hidden from him? There were no easy answers, but Garrett knew that June needed some kind of reassurance. "I'd like to think she did," Garrett said quietly. Evelyn was a complicated person. She had her reasons for keeping things to herself, I'm sure. But I believe that if she had had more time, if things had been different, She would have told you. She would have wanted you to know? June looked down, her expression thoughtful. I hope so, she murmured. I just wish I could ask her, you know. There are so many things I want to know about her. So many things I'll never have the chance to ask. Garrett felt a deep pang of sympathy for her. He had spent years asking himself similar questions, wondering what could have been if Evelyn had lived. But unlike June, he had at least known her. He had shared a life with her, however brief it had been. June Das, on the other hand, had been left with nothing but fragments of a past she could never fully understand. We'll figure it out together, Garrett said gently. We'll keep searching, and we'll find the answers. It might take time, but we'll get there. June smiled at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, Garrett. I don't know what I'd do without you. Garrett smiled back, feeling a warmth in his chest that he hadn't experienced in a long time. You won't have to find out, he said softly. I'm not going anywhere. As they continued their walk, Garrett couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed since June had entered his life. She had brought something back into his world that he hadn't even realized was missing. A sense of purpose, of connection. For so long, he had lived in the shadow of his grief. But now, with June by his side, he felt like he was finally beginning to emerge from that darkness. Later that evening, after June had gone home, Garrett sat in his study, thinking about the future. Their relationship had grown stronger over the past few weeks, and though the shadow of Evelyn still lingered between them, it no longer felt like an insurmountable obstacle. Instead, it felt like a bridge, something that connected them rather than separated them. But as comforting as that thought was, Garrett couldn't ignore the nagging questions that still haunted him. The letters June had found, the photograph of the man with Evelyn, they were pieces of a puzzle that remained unsolved. And Garrett knew that until they uncovered the full truth, there would always be a part of Evelyn's life that remained out of reach. He picked up the photograph again, studying the man's face. There was something familiar about him, though Garrett couldn't quite place it. The more he looked, the more he felt that this man, whoever he was, held the key to understanding Evelyn's past. And then, a thought struck him. There was one place he hadn't looked yet, one place that might hold the answers they were searching for. Evelyn had left behind more than just memories and letters. There were records, medical records, perhaps even personal journals, that might shed light on the questions they had been asking. Garrett stood up, his mind racing. It was time to dig deeper, to uncover the parts of Evelyn's life that had remained hidden for so long, for June's sake, and for his own. He would call her tomorrow and tell her his plan. Together, they would continue searching. Together, they would find the truth. The next morning, Garrett woke up with a sense of determination he hadn't felt in years. There was no more room for hesitation. The time had come to dig deeper into Evelyn's past, to uncover the truth that had remained buried for so long. He was no longer just searching for answers for himself. This was for June, too. She deserved to know everything about her mother, and Garrett was committed to helping her piece together the missing parts of her life. He grabbed his phone and dialed June's number. She picked up almost immediately, her voice a little groggy but curious. "Morning, Garrett. What's going on?" "I've been thinking," Garrett began, his tone serious. "We've been working with scraps of information, those letters, the photo, but I think there's more out there. There must be medical records, or maybe even personal journals Evelyn left behind. If we can find those, it might help us fill in the gaps." June was quiet for a moment, clearly processing what he had said. "You think we might find out who my father is?" she asked, her voice tentative, almost hopeful. "I do," Garrett replied, "but we'll need to go through official channels. I have contacts in the medical field from my business dealings. If there's anything in Evelyn's medical records that could give us more information, I can help us get access." June let out a slow breath. "Okay," she said, her voice steady. "Let's do it. I need to know." They made plans to meet later that afternoon and begin the process. Garrett had already contacted a private investigator he trusted, someone discreet who could help them track down the records they needed. The rest of the day felt like a blur as Garrett moved through his meetings and phone calls, his mind always drifting back to what they might find. When June arrived at his house later that day, her face was a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. Garrett greeted her with a reassuring smile and led her to his study, where he had everything ready for the next step in their search. "I've already spoken to someone who can help," Garrett explained as they sat down. "They'll need a few days to gather the information, but I'm hopeful we'll have something soon." June nodded, her hands fidgeting slightly in her lap. "I'm nervous," she admitted. "What if we don't find anything? Or worse, what if we find something I'm not ready to deal with?" Garrett reached across the table, placing a comforting hand over hers. "Whatever we find, we'll deal with it together. You're not alone in this." June gave him a grateful smile, though the uncertainty in her eyes remained. "Thanks, Garrett. I don't know what I'd do without you." As they waited for the private investigator's report over the next few days, Garrett and June continued talking about Evelyn, about their growing relationship, and about the future. Each conversation brought them closer, and Garrett felt that their bond was now stronger than ever. But beneath the surface, there was always the lingering tension of the unknown. They both knew that whatever answers they found could change everything. It was on the third day that Garrett received the call. The investigator had located Evelyn's medical records, as well as a few other documents that might be relevant. Garrett's heart raced as he listened to the details over the phone, trying to absorb the information while mentally preparing for what they might uncover. "There's something you should know," the investigator said, his voice cautious. "One of the documents we found, it's a paternity test." Garrett's stomach dropped. "A paternity test," he repeated, his voice tight. He glanced at June, who was sitting across the room, anxiously watching his expression. "Yes," the investigator continued. "It was done shortly before Evelyn's death. It confirms that you, Garrett, are the biological father of June." The words hit Garrett like a freight train. For a moment, he couldn't speak, couldn't think. He stared blankly at the papers in front of him, trying to process what he had just heard. His mind reeled as the enormity of the revelation settled in. All this time, he had been searching for answers about June's father, never realizing that he was the answer. Garrett's hand trembled as he hung up the phone. He sat there in stunned silence, the weight of the truth pressing down on him like a tidal wave. June, his daughter. He hadn't known. He hadn't even suspected. And yet, it was true. June's voice broke the silence. "Garrett, what is it? What did they say?" Garrett looked up at her, his throat dry. He didn't know how to begin, didn't know how to tell her that everything they had been searching for had been right in front of them all along. "June," he said slowly, his voice trembling. "The investigator found a paternity test, done shortly before Evelyn passed away." June's eyes widened, confusion and fear flickering across her face. "A paternity test? What does that mean?" Garrett swallowed hard, forcing the words out. It means I'm your father, June." The silence that followed was deafening. June stared at him, her mouth slightly open, her eyes wide with shock. For a moment, it seemed like she couldn't comprehend what he had just said. Then, slowly, the realization dawned on her, and tears welled up in her eyes. You're my father," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Garrett nodded, his heart breaking at the sight of her. "I didn't know. I swear, June, I didn't know. If I had known, things would have been different." June stood up abruptly, stepping away from the table as if the weight of the revelation was too much to bear. "I can't believe this," she said, her voice shaking. "All this time, I've been looking for answers, trying to figure out who I am. And you're my father." Garrett felt a surge of guilt wash over him. "I'm so sorry, June. I wish I could have told you sooner. But I didn't know. I didn't even know Evelyn was pregnant." June turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mix of anger, sadness, and confusion. Why didn't she tell you? Why didn't she tell me? How could she keep something like this a secret? Garrett stood up, taking a cautious step toward her. I don't know. Maybe she was scared, or maybe she thought she was protecting you. But what matters now is that we know the truth. And I want to be here for you, June. I want to be the father you've been searching for. June wiped her tears, her breathing ragged. I don't even know what to feel right now, she admitted. This changes everything. I know, Garrett said softly, his voice filled with emotion, but we'll figure it out. Together. They stood in silence, the weight of the revelation hanging between them. Garrett's heart ached for June, for the years they had lost, for the life they could have shared if only he had known. But now, with the truth finally out, there was a chance to build something new. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be challenges ahead. But for the first time in years, Garrett felt a glimmer of hope. They had found the truth, and now they had the opportunity to create a future that neither of them had ever imagined. The revelation of Garrett being June's father hung heavily in the air, creating a new reality that neither of them had been prepared for. The shock was still fresh for both of them, and though they had spent the past few days apart, each trying to process the truth on their own, Garrett knew they couldn't avoid the conversation forever. He needed to face this with June, no matter how difficult it might be. Sitting in his study, Garrett replayed the phone call with the investigator in his mind. The paternity test, Evelyn's decision to keep it a secret, and the countless years that had passed where he unknowingly had a daughter out there in the world. The guilt gnawed at him, a constant reminder of all the time he had lost. If only he had known. If only things had been different. He could have been there for June from the beginning. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from June. June, can we meet? I think we need to talk. Garrett exhaled slowly. This was the moment he had been anticipating, but also dreading. He quickly typed back a response. Garrett, of course, I'm here. Come over whenever you're ready. Less than an hour later, Garrett heard the sound of the front door opening. He stood up from his desk as June walked into the room, her expression a mixture of anxiety and determination. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for something. Perhaps answers. Perhaps reassurance. Hi, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Hi, Garrett replied, offering her a tentative smile. I'm glad you're here. June nodded, but didn't return the smile. Instead, she crossed her arms, looking down at the floor for a moment before speaking again. I've been thinking a lot about everything. About you, about my mom, about what all of this means. Garrett braced himself, unsure of what she would say next. I understand. I've been thinking a lot too. June glanced up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of hurt and confusion. I just don't get it, Garrett. How could she keep this from you? From me? I spent my whole life wondering who my father was, and the whole time, you were right there. It doesn't make sense. Garrett's chest tightened at her words. He had asked himself the same questions, over and over again. But no matter how many times he tried to make sense of it, the truth was still elusive. I wish I had answers for you, June, he said gently. I've been trying to figure it out myself. Maybe she thought she was protecting you, or maybe she thought she was protecting me, but I don't know why she didn't tell either of us. June's brow furrowed as she processed his words. I keep going over it in my head, trying to come up with a reason, but I can't. It just hurts, Garrett. It hurts to think that my mom kept this from us. Garrett took a deep breath, stepping closer to her. I know it does, he said quietly. And I'm so sorry for all the pain this has caused you. If I had known, God, June, if I had known you were my daughter, things would have been different. I would have been there for you. I would have done everything in my power to be the father you deserved." June's eyes welled up with tears, but she blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. "But you didn't know," she said, her voice wavering. "And I can't blame you for that. I don't know how to deal with this." Garrett felt a lump form in his throat. "You don't have to deal with it alone," he said softly. "We'll figure this out together. I know we've lost a lot of time, but we still have the chance to build something. We can't change the past, but we can decide what happens next." June looked at him, her expression conflicted. "I don't even know what next looks like, Garrett. I've spent my whole life without a father, and now, suddenly, I have one. It's overwhelming." Garrett nodded, understanding the weight of what she was feeling. "I know it's overwhelming, and I don't expect this to be easy. But I want to be there for you now, in whatever way you need. I know I can't make up for lost time, but I can promise you that I'm not going anywhere." June was silent for a moment, her arms still crossed tightly around herself. Then, slowly, she uncrossed her arms and took a hesitant step closer to Garrett. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "But I want to try. I want to figure out what it means to have a father and to have you in my life." Garrett's heart swelled with emotion. This was the moment he had hoped for, the chance to build a relationship with June, even after all the years they had lost. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll take it one step at a time," he said softly. "There's no rush. We'll figure it out together." June looked up at him, and for the first time since their meeting, she smiled. Just a small, tentative smile, but it was enough. Garrett smiled back, feeling a sense of hope that he hadn't felt in years. This was the beginning of something new, something that could heal the wounds they both carried. They sat down together in the living room, the conversation turning from the heavy weight of the truth to lighter topics: June's job, Garrett's work, and the little things that made up their daily lives. It felt natural, almost easy, to talk like this, as if the tension of the past few days was finally starting to lift. As the evening wore on, Garrett found himself feeling grateful. Grateful that June had come to him. Grateful that she was willing to give him a chance. He knew it wouldn't be an easy road ahead. There would still be difficult conversations, painful memories to confront. But for the first time, he felt like they were on the same path, moving forward together. Eventually, June stood to leave, giving Garrett a hug before she walked out the door. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." Garrett watched her go, his heart full. "Thank you, June," he said softly, "for giving me this chance." As he closed the door behind her, Garrett leaned against the wall, letting out a deep breath. The revelation of their connection had shaken both of them to their core, but in the aftermath, something new was beginning to take shape. It was fragile, yes, but it was real. For the first time in years, Garrett allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could finally have the family he had always wanted. In the days that followed their heart-to-heart conversation, Garrett found himself thinking more and more about what his relationship with June would look like. The revelation of their bond had been a shock to both of them, but now that they had faced it, a new chapter was unfolding. Yet, despite the glimmers of hope, Garrett couldn't ignore the weight of the guilt that still sat heavily on his chest. There was so much time lost, so many moments that he would never get back. How could he make up for an entire lifetime of not being there for June? One evening, Garrett sat alone in his study, a drink in his hand, staring out the window at the darkening sky. The city lights twinkled in the distance, but his thoughts were far away, lost in the memories of Evelyn and the life they could have had together. The what-ifs circled in his mind. If he had known about June, if Evelyn had told him the truth, would everything have been different? Would they have been a family? His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from June. "June, can we talk?" Garrett's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't heard from her since their conversation days ago, and he had been giving her space to process everything. He quickly typed back, "Garrett, of course. Do you want to come over?" June, "Yeah, I'll be there soon." Garrett sat up, running a hand through his hair, nerves flickering through him. This could be another pivotal moment, another step toward healing or potentially something more difficult. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew that whatever it was, they would face it together. Half an hour later, there was a knock at the door. Garrett opened it to find June standing there, her expression a mixture of uncertainty and resolve. She smiled softly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hi," she said quietly. "Hi," Garrett replied, stepping aside to let her in. "Come in." They walked into the living room, and Garrett motioned for her to sit. As she sank into the couch, he could see the tension in her posture, the way her fingers nervously twisted together in her lap. "Is everything okay?" Garrett asked gently, sitting down across from her. June sighed, looking down at her hands for a moment before meeting his eyes. "I've been thinking a lot," she began, her voice careful. "About us. About what comes next." Garrett felt his chest tighten slightly. He had been wondering the same thing. What came next? How did they move forward from here? He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I've been thinking about that too," he said softly. "There's a lot we still need to figure out." June nodded, her brow furrowed as she spoke. "I want to try, Garrett. I want to get to know you as my father. I want to understand who you are, but more than that, I want to understand what it means for us to have this connection. But it's hard. It's really hard to wrap my head around the fact that you're the man I've been searching for my entire life." Garrett's heart ached at her words. He wanted nothing more than to ease her pain, to reassure her that they would find their way through this together. But he knew this wasn't something that could be fixed with a few comforting words. They had both been through so much, June with her years of uncertainty, and Garrett with the realization that he had missed out on being a father. "I know it's hard," Garrett said softly. "I can't imagine how overwhelming this must be for you. And I'm not going to pretend that I have all the answers. But I want to be here for you, June. Whatever you need, I'm here." June swallowed, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm scared, Garrett. I'm scared that I'll never feel like I belong anywhere. I've spent so long trying to figure out who I am, and now that I know you're my father, it feels like I should be relieved. But instead, I just feel lost." Garrett stood up and crossed the room, sitting down beside her on the couch. He reached out and gently took her hand in his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You're not lost, June. You've found something. You've found me, and I've found you. That's not the end of the search, it's the beginning. We have a lot of time to make up for, and I know it won't be easy. But I promise you, we'll figure it out. You belong here, with me. You always have." June looked at him, her eyes full of uncertainty. But there was also a glimmer of hope there, something fragile but real. She squeezed his hand, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I want to believe that. I really do. But I'm still trying to understand what all of this means, what it means for us to be a family." Garrett nodded, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "Family isn't about perfection. It's about being there for each other, through the good and the bad. And I know we've lost a lot of time, but we have now. We have the future." June's eyes filled with tears, and this time, she didn't try to hold them back. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away, her breath shaky. "I'm just scared I'll mess it up," she whispered. Garrett's heart broke for her. He had seen this vulnerability in himself so many times over the years, the fear of not being enough, of failing the people he loved. But he wasn't going to let that fear define them. Not now. "You won't mess it up," Garrett said softly. "We'll take it one day at a time. We'll make mistakes. We'll have hard days. But we'll get through them. Together." June looked at him for a long moment, her expression slowly softening. "You really mean that?" Garrett nodded, his voice full of sincerity. "I do. You're not alone in this anymore." For the first time in what felt like forever, June allowed herself to believe it. She let out a shaky breath and leaned into Garrett, resting her head against his shoulder. Garrett wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. And for the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. This wasn't about fixing the past. It was about moving forward, about building something new from the pieces they had been given. They sat there in silence for a long time, the weight of their shared grief and hope hanging in the air between them. There was still so much to work through, so much to figure out. But for now, this moment was enough. Garrett closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of June beside him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. They were no longer bound by the secrets of the past. They were free to create something new. And as they sat together, the sun setting in the distance, Garrett knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The next few weeks were filled with a sense of tentative hope, as Garrett and June began to rebuild their lives together, slowly learning what it meant to be a family. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of uncertainty, moments when the weight of all they had lost hung heavily in the air. But each day brought them closer, and with every conversation, every shared meal, they found themselves moving forward, piece by piece. For Garrett, the transition wasn't without its challenges. He had spent so many years living in the shadow of his grief for Evelyn, allowing the pain of losing her to define him. But now, with June in his life, that pain was slowly being replaced by something else, something brighter, more hopeful. There were still moments when he found himself mourning the time they had lost, the years he hadn't known he had a daughter, but he was learning to let go of that guilt, to focus on the time they had now. One evening, Garrett and June sat in his living room, a fire crackling in the fireplace. They had made it a habit to spend their evenings together when they could, talking about their days, sharing stories, and just enjoying each other's company. It was something Garrett had never thought he would have. These quiet moments of connection with someone who shared his blood. But now, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. June leaned back on the couch, sipping a cup of tea, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she said after a while, "I've been thinking a lot about my mom lately, about everything she must have gone through." Garrett looked over at her, nodding. "I think about her too," he said softly. "Every day." June smiled faintly. "I wonder what she would think of all this, of us, of how things turned out." Garrett's heart tightened at the thought. It was something he had wondered often, especially in the weeks since discovering the truth about June. "I think she would be proud," he said after a moment. "I think she would be happy to know that we found each other." June looked down at her cup, her fingers tracing the rim. "I hope so," she murmured. "I wish I could ask her why she kept it a secret, why she didn't tell us the truth." Garrett sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I've asked myself that question so many times," he admitted. "I wish I had an answer for you, but I think, in her own way, she was trying to protect us. Maybe she thought it was easier this way. Maybe she thought we'd be better off not knowing." June was quiet for a moment, processing his words. "Do you think she was right? Do you think it was easier?" Garrett shook his head, his voice steady but full of emotion. "No, I don't think it was easier. But I think she did what she thought was best at the time. We can't change what happened, but we can choose what to do with the truth now that we have it." June nodded slowly, her eyes thoughtful. "I've been trying to make peace with it," she said quietly. "It's not easy. but I think I'm getting there." Garrett smiled, proud of her strength. "You're doing great, June. It's okay to take your time with it. None of this is easy." She smiled back at him, a soft, grateful smile that made Garrett's heart swell with pride. They had come so far in such a short time, and though there were still hurdles to overcome, he could see the progress they had made. They were no longer two strangers bound by a shared loss. They were father and daughter, slowly but surely building the relationship they had both longed for. As the night wore on, they continued talking, sharing stories about Evelyn and the little things that had shaped their lives. Garrett told her more about his time with Evelyn, about the woman she had been before June was born. And in turn, June opened up about her life in the orphanage, about the challenges she had faced and the resilience she had built. It wasn't until late in the evening that June finally stood to leave. She wrapped her scarf around her neck and turned to Garrett, her expression serious but hopeful. "I've been thinking about something," she said, her voice steady. Garrett raised an eyebrow, curious. "What's that?" June hesitated for a moment, as if gathering her courage. "I've been thinking that maybe I'd like to move closer. I know I've been staying in the city, but I think I want to be near you. I want to build a life here with you in it." Garrett's heart swelled at her words. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected her to make such a big step so soon, but it was exactly what he had hoped for. The idea of having her close, of building a life together, filled him with a sense of joy he hadn't felt in years. "I'd love that, June," he said softly, his voice full of emotion. "I'd love for you to be close." June smiled, and for the first time, it felt like the weight of everything they had been through was beginning to lift. They weren't just navigating the past anymore. They were looking toward the future. A future where they could be a family, where they could build something new out of the broken pieces of their past. "I'll start looking for places tomorrow," June said, her voice light with excitement. "I'm ready for this." Garrett smiled, pride and love swelling in his chest. "Take your time. You're always welcome here until you find the right place." As June headed for the door, she paused, turning back to him with a thoughtful look on her face. "You know," she said softly, "I think my mom would be happy. I think she'd be glad that we found each other." Garrett felt a lump form in his throat, but he smiled through it. "I think so too." As the door closed behind her, Garrett stood in the quiet of his home, a sense of peace settling over him. The journey had been long, and there were still challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. The past would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. He and June were creating something new, something real, and that was enough. Looking out at the night sky, Garrett let out a long breath. He had found his daughter, and together they were finding their way. The future, uncertain as it might be, felt brighter now. For the first time, he wasn't alone. He had June, he had a family, and that was more than he ever could have hoped for.